All right, so I am going to go over my Zoo API project. So I want to start off by showing the SQL database. So this was created from a CSV file that I found on the internet and just imported into MySQL Workbench. So I used alter table to add an animal ID as a primary key for each animal in the table. So that's our database that the API is going to pull from. So this is the launch settings file where we set the launch URL and the localhost URLs. So all we have in our main method is create host builder, and then we build and run the host. So then to do that, we are using a method down here, create host builder. And basically what we're doing here, we're building a default host using the startup settings from over here in our startup file. So we create an iConfiguration interface and call it configuration. And then down here, we configure our services. We have our add controllers method, and then we have our services.addScope. And add scoped, we are creating our connection to our SQL database that is being pulled from our app settings.json. So it gives it some encapsulation, and we don't pass that up to GitHub or anything, so that our connection password and information can't be accessed by users. So we have services.add transient here. And our connection is going to be only created once per request. And then that's why we do that one is add scoped. And then we have the iZoo animals repo. So this is our repo interface. And then we have our repo, and those are being added as transients. So they're created for each request. We are using cores here so that our app can be more accessible, so that it's not only specific to a certain domain or individual URLs. And then we have our configure file down here. Our configure method down here. And in here, we are using the HTTPS redirection, so that if a user uses HTTP, it redirects it to HTTPS in the URL. And then we have use routing. This is the method that's going to find the endpoints. And then we are using cores that we set up earlier. And then we have use authorization, which we're not really doing anything with that, but it's there in case we want to add any authorization attributes. And then we have use endpoints. This is going to execute the endpoint, whereas routing is going to find the endpoint. And we're going to execute it with the controllers that we have mapped. After that, we have the zoo animals class over here. We have our default constructor, and then we have all of the properties here that are coming from the database. So after that, we have our repo interface. We have a get all animals stubbed out method. We have get animal, insert animal, update animal, and delete animal. This is going to allow users to use all CRUD functionality with this API. And then we can come over here to the repo that inherits from the interface repo, where we are creating a new instance of the connection here, so we can connect to our SQL database. And then we have our methods no longer stubbed out, but fully fleshed out. We have our, so This is to get all animals here, this method. We are going to query the database asking for all zoo animals. So we say select all from zoo, which is our database, and then zoo animals, which is our table. So, and then we have the single get animal here, and we actually have a parameter here called animal ID, because if we just want to get one single animal, we need to know the ID, and then we pass that into our query single or default method here. And then we say select all from zoo.zoo animals, where the animal ID is equal to our animal ID that we pass in. And then we have insert animal. So in our insert animal method here, we use connection.execute rather than query, because we want to actually make a change to that table in our database. And we use insert into at these values that we specify. And basically what we're doing here is setting our properties in our C# application here to equal the properties in the table in our database. And then down here, we have update animal, which again, we're making a change to the database. So we use the execute method, and in SQL, we say update, and then we specify the table, and we set all of our properties where the animal ID is equal to the animal ID of the animal that we pass through. And then down here, in our last method, we have delete animal. So again, we pass through an animal of type animal, and we use the execute method with SQL to delete from zoo.zoo animals, which is, again, our table in our database, where the animal ID is equal to the animal ID of the animal that we pass through. All right, so finally, we have our controller. And in our controller, we are creating a variable repo that is of type iZooAnimals repo, which is our interface. And this, creating an instance of it, is going to allow us to use these methods that we created in it and then fleshed out in animals repo. So the first one, HTTP GET, is what we're using because we want to get all animals from the database. So here's the repo variable that we instantiated, which is our interface, and we access the get all animals method from the interface. And then we return that information in the form of JSON. And then to get a single animal, we are passing in the animal ID in the HTTP GET. We're using our interface to use the get animal method with the animal ID passed through it, so that we can return that specific animal in the form of JSON to the user. And then we have our post functionality down here, which we use the get all animals dot last or default to get the last animal ID. That way, when we have the last animal ID, we can increment it by 1 to get the new animal's ID that the user is inserting here. So that allows the user to insert an animal. Then we have our HTTP put with the animal ID passed in, and this one is allowing the users to update the animal. So we have create, read, update, and then our last one is down here going to be delete. So that finishes off our CRUD functionality. And this one is going to take the animal ID of the animal you want to delete, and it's going to pass that into get animal from the repo. And then we do repo.delete animal, and it's going to pass in animal to delete, and it's going to delete the animal with that ID. Okay, so that was the code. So let's run this and I'll demonstrate the API. All right, so it's up and running. So we're going to come over here using the get method. We're just going to get our single animal, and the argument is the animal ID that we pass in. So we'll just say animal 21, and we get back our JSON data here. So our animal name at animal ID 21 is the dove. And then all the details and properties that are in the database are sent back as well. So now let's try get all animals, which remember, we don't need a parameter here because we're just querying for every single thing in the database. So let's send that. And here we go. We have all animals up to 101 and their properties, their characteristics. Okay, we're using the post method to insert an animal now. Go over to body because we want to specify in the form of JSON all of the properties and the name and all that good stuff of the animal. Notice we don't specify the animal ID because that is automatically incremented back in our post method. So let's try that out. We're saying a new species is the name. Send it. Okay, now let's go check our database. Let's refresh it. Say select all animals from zoo animals, or select all from zoo animals, and there it is. New species, and this is at 103 because I've already previously tested it. So we come back over here. That one worked. Now let's check our put. So again, we come over to the body and we're going to update an animal name to froghead bass, whatever that is, something I made up. We're going to update animal 103, which was our new species that we just created. So we're changing that new species to froghead bass. We're going to send it, and we're going to refresh it and query all from the zoo animals table. And there it is, froghead bass. It's a froghead bass with hair. All right. And then lastly, let's check our delete functionality. So let's go ahead and delete that froghead bass. It was a normal bass, so it's not a new species. So at animal ID 103, we're going to delete it. We're going to refresh our database and again, query all from this table. And voila, it's gone. No more species there. All right. And that's it. That's my zoo API. Thanks for watching.